Assalamu alaikum, Bismillah. Welcome everyone to the first of two virtual discussions that Believers Bailout is hosting with scholars, activists, and community members leading up to the month of Ramadan. My name is Ala. I'm a PhD student at the University of Chicago and a longtime member of Believers Bailout. I'll be moderating our discussion today on Zakat and the possibilities towards abolition, featuring Dr. Kecia Ali, Dr. Rami Nsour, and Dr. Abdoulaye Ndiaye. Before introducing our wonderful speakers, I would like to reintroduce Believers Bailout. For those of you who are engaging with us for the first time, welcome. And for those also who have been following us from afar, welcome again. Believers Bailout is a community-led effort established by women Muslim scholars in 2018 to direct Zakat towards bailing out Muslims in pretrial incarceration and ICE custody. Based in Chicago, home to the largest single-site jail in the United States, Believers Bailout supports efforts to abolish money bail and to raise awareness within Muslim communities on the injustices of the money bail bond system, immigration bonds, and the broader prison industrial complex of which they form part. So, given our mission, we at Believers Bailout have for years been really eager to have a robust conversation with scholars and activists about the nature of zakah and how thinking creatively about the intellectual, the moral, the material resources that zakat offers can enable us as Muslims to have an intervention into problems endemic to American racial capitalism and the prison industrial complex. So our goal for today's discussion is really to further enrich our work and increase our community's understanding of the purpose and function of zakah in our context of extreme poverty, of racial capitalism, and mass incarceration. Our wonderful speakers for today are our first speaker would be Dr. Kecia Ali. Dr. Ali is actually one of our co-founders of Believers Bailout. She's a professor of religion, gender, and ethics at Boston University. Dr. Ali focuses on the Muslim tradition, including pre-modern Islamic law and the prophetic biography, and modern intersections of Muslim and Western discourses about gender and sexuality. She also works on popular fiction, looking at human flourishing in J.D. Robb's futuristic police procedurals, race and religion. Our second speaker would be Shaykh Rami Nsour. Shaykh Rami is the founding director of Taiba Foundation, the first organization in the United States to offer a distance learning program in Islamic education to incarcerated men and women. He's also a scholar, a counselor, a public speaker, teacher, and translator of Islamic texts, spending over 10 years within the Mauritanian tradition, the Mahdara system of studying Islam. Our third speaker is Dr. Abdoulaye Ndiaye. Dr. Ndiaye is an assistant professor of economics at NYU. Professor Ndiaye's research focuses on macroeconomics and public finance. Recently, Dr. Ndiaye has contributed to the Islamic Moral Theology and the Future Project by writing an essay exploring how zakat offers resources for addressing wealth inequality in both Muslim and non-Muslim countries. So today we'll listen up to a few short talks by each of our speakers. Then we'll have a conversation and a discussion moderated by me between the speakers, and then we'll open it up to Q&A from audience. So if you have a question, save it, pose it later, and we'll make sure to address it. But the floor is yours, Dr. Kecia.
Thank you. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I'm thrilled to be part of this conversation. It is kind of astonishing that Believers Bailout began 6 years ago, actually, with a conference that happened at Smith College on women and Islam. And the genesis of what has now become this amazing organization to which incredible volunteers have devoted so much of their time and affected so many lives was a series of panels that raised a number of questions that got people thinking. So first, what happened is Dr. Amina Wadud was on a panel, and in the Q&A, abolition came up. Dr. Maital Hassan asked something about abolition, and that sort of started the wheels turning. In the next panel, which was a student panel, one of the students said something about Islam as the basis for her social justice activism. And somehow, in a conversation over lunch, Maital Hassan, Dr. Suad Al Khabir, and I were having this conversation, the alchemy of abolition and social justice and Islam. And there was this moment where it was just blindingly obvious that zakat could be used for bail. If we're talking about criminalization, if we're talking about the carceral system that's built in the United States, if we're talking about race and racial injustice and Islam and American Muslims, here is this thing that maybe we could be doing something with. And obviously, we were inspired by the National Bailout Organization, the organization that had been running the Free Black Mamas campaign very successfully and is still doing so. That was the beginning. And this was, I don't know, like February. And Ramadan then was in May and June. And we wanted to get started. We didn't have very much time. And so the goal was a launch during Ramadan. Yes, with a Launch Good page for fundraising. But the other thing we really wanted to do as we developed this program was to do bailout iftars as a community mechanism for raising money, but also for raising consciousness. Because a lot of what happens in American Muslim communities is you have wealthy suburban Muslim communities that are zakat payers, and you have poorer Muslim communities, sometimes immigrant, often African American, that are on the whole zakat recipients or at least zakat eligible. And so part of what we really wanted to do was make connections between some American Muslims from immigrant backgrounds or second generation, third generation, who think about the criminalization of American Muslims in terms of surveillance and terrorism and the FBI and international political stuff, and don't necessarily make the connections to other kinds of criminalization, other kinds of surveillance that are going on in the US. And so part of the hope and the vision was to get actual connections between people, but also intellectual connections starting to be made between these different modalities of criminalization. And so the toolkit that was the primary thing that I did in the lead up to that first Ramadan, with lots of collaboration from lots of important volunteers, was to put together a toolkit modeled again on the toolkit that the National Bailout used to bring the religious piece, the political piece, the money bail system, carceral economy in the US piece together so that folks who were interested, yes, could give money, absolutely, but could also plug themselves in to this larger system. And so that was sort of the big thing that we were doing. We reached out to a number of scholars, people with expertise through Islamic traditional learning. Zainab al-Ansari was one of the people we reached out to, and there were others. And everybody sort of was on board with the idea of using zakat for bail, but all of them, as scholars often do, offered different rationales for why this was permissible. Maybe it was permissible because these were people who were needy or were poor or had debts that they couldn't pay. Or maybe it was because enslavement in the US is akin to, maybe analogous to, maybe even a form of enslavement. We've all seen 13, right? And so those were arguments sort of that people were having at the theoretical level, but at the practical level, it was sort of agreed that this was a thing we could do. And then it came to be the practicalities of how do we make this work, and choosing to work through existing bond funds and so forth. And we've done that we have memoranda of understanding with a number of bond funds. We've worked to bail folks out through Massachusetts and some other places, most often in Chicago through the Chicago Community Bail Fund, bond fund maybe. And those have been incredibly important resources. Increasingly, BBO has also worked to free people from immigration detention, which is another kind of jail. And we see in the US the ways that this isn't a specific distinct system, but is very much embedded in a carceral economy. And as people have moved to abolish money bail entirely, right, part of a broader move towards abolishing the current system of jails and prisons and incarceration, we've seen that the economic model for the stakeholders in these carceral institutions have shifted. And so now they're making money from immigration bonds and immigration detention. And so, Believers Bailout started from this one very simple idea, right, about zakat and bail. But it is, like everything else, embedded in a very important and complicated set of social and community connections. And as its work has evolved, it's been really incredible to see the number of people who have gotten involved as volunteers, as contributors. I watched that Launch Good page pretty obsessively that first Ramadan, and it was amazing how many people gave $1, $2, $3. There were some, $500 and $1,000 and even a $10,000 contribution. But all those people who just wanted to be part of something, right, and gave what they could, the barakah from that is incredible. And so it's been a privilege, it's been a journey, and I'm really grateful for all the work that everybody has done to take this little light bulb moment into something real that exists in the world.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kecia. This is wonderful. Just the genesis and the history of it all. It's always been part of BPO for a few years now. It's really nice to hear the first few years of all of that work. And I'm actually excited to ask a few questions later on about this kind of theory and practice dimension of the work we do. But for now, I want to turn it to Shaykh Rami. The floor is yours.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Kecia, as well, for giving that history. I've been aware of Believers Bailout, and since it started, and have seen it grow, and I've been very happy to see it grow because I know the impact. And working with people who are incarcerated for over 20 years now. So I started working. The first student I had who was incarcerated was in 2000. So actually now, like almost 24 years, I've seen the impacts of how incarceration impacts people's lives and their family. And then knowing that the bonds are posting bonds as little as $200 or $300, I know sometimes it's more, but if something like that, if we connect somebody who's giving zakat to somebody who's in prison, and $200 or $300 can get them back with their family, give them their freedom and maintain that dignity and just the mental sanity of, if it's an unpaid parking ticket that turned into a warrant and just ballooned out of, and I know there's various different type of things, but just to know that there's people out there who now, they can turn to Believers Bailout. And we've referred people to your organization, and especially in the Chicagoland organization, to know that, there's this symbiotic relationship that if people reach out to Believers Bailout and they need education, direct them towards Teba. And then if they're coming to us and they say, we have some bail issues, all right, this is a great sign to see the development of the Muslim nonprofit world in North America and here in the United States. What I wanted to share was a little bit about my experience, and for the viewers, and this is hopefully would encourage them to do a couple of things, to direct your donations towards Believers Bailout because of the impact that it can have, and to hear some of the stories of the impact. So we don't at Teba, we don't get involved with, or we've never actually got involved into the bail system. And so to know that there's an organization out there that's understanding the dynamics and how to really utilize that, like you said, Dr. Kecia, there's people giving zakat, there's people in need. Let's make that connection and take that light bulb moment and turn it into something that's now a movement. And there's other people who are looking at it and seeing, can we develop and build upon that. And so what I wanted to talk about was the impact of zakat, and to really go to the spirit of the law, because there's two things that we're bound by. Well, one, that we're really bound by both. Two things. One, the letter of the law, and then the spirit of the law. And so what I mean by the letter of the law is that we do have regulations. So we do have a zakat regulation, and who can receive it, what is a recipient, what are the intentions. There's this whole body of legal work, of Sharia work about that. And so that's one of the parameters that we have to work within. At the same time, one of the things that can motivate us to figure out new solutions without compromising those things is to take those light bulb moments and say, hey, is there a way that we can leverage that without compromising our Sharia, while at the same time having major impact? Because that $200 or $300 or $400 of zakat, if it went to a family to buy groceries, does it have impact? Yes. Are people's lives changed? Yes. But if that $200 was also needed by somebody to be able to post bail, and now they can get back to their family and provide for their family and just have the, where are we getting the most bang for our buck, so to speak? So we still want people to support those families and need to get the groceries. And we also want to direct that zakat to where we have this bigger impact. And I want to share with you just 3 stories of Taiba where we've seen the impact of zakat of making that connection. So where we've seen the ability to make that connection is that when people who have long-term incarceration and they have to go up before a board of parole, they most of the time they don't have the money to be able to pay for it. They're in prison jobs where they're making as little as 5 cents an hour, all the way up to $1 or $1.50. In California, they have fire camps lining the Sierra Nevadas. There's actually 33 prisons and 44 fire camps. And those firefighters, they're prisoners, and it's voluntarily done, but they're out there fighting these fires, live fires, right next to the Cal Fire people. And they get $1.50 a day when there's not an active fire, and they get $1.50 an hour when they're fighting an active fire. So they're not the point is that that's the high-end jobs, $1.50 an hour fighting a fire. So if you're making 10-15 cents an hour, you're not making that much money. I'm sure many viewers have seen that post that rightfully went viral, where a prisoner here in California donated $17 and some change to Gaza, and it took him 136 hours to make that $17. So that's the world of the prison. Now that's in the prisons. In the jails, they don't have those opportunities for jobs. So even if a person wanted to say, all right, my bail is $400, let me get a job at the jail to make that money, it's not available. So that's where the impact of Believers Bailout comes in, that they're providing for people in the jail systems that don't have access to the prison jobs that the people in state or federal prisons do, and even that is limited. Well, what happens when they come up and they need to have a lawyer? So we had a couple of students that went before the board of parole, and these people are coming at them with they're throwing the book at, they're trying to keep them in the prison, because, and you mentioned, Dr. Kecia, the 13th. Anybody who has not watched that, please watch that movie, and you'll understand the impact of the work that Believers Bailout does that much more. One of the main ways that they make money is not only in the prison industries, what's called like PIA, Prison Industry Association, and so forth. And it's also in just housing them and collecting the taxpayer money. And that's $30,000 a year, all the way up to $500,000 a year in the medical facilities, $1 million plus in the supermaxes and the maximums. So there's a lot of money to be made just on the tax revenue that they're generating for these prisoners. So there's a lot of incentive to keep them housed. So when they go up for parole, they're not really interested in freeing them. They're interested in getting them to stay in on a technicality. So if they have a lawyer with them, there's that much more chance for a person to gain their freedom. Now, a lawyer might cost $4,000, $5,000 or more. Somebody making 5, 6, 20, 30 cents an hour doesn't have that money. So we have been, in a couple of instances, been able to connect the zakat givers, like you said, Dr. Kecia, from those suburban, wealthier communities with somebody who's in prison, to pay for a lawyer to represent them at the board of parole and to gain their freedom. And I've seen that happen multiple times. That's the power of zakat. That we can, there's one thing, when I said the letter of the law is, we have a parameters in how to give zakat. So you've fulfilled your obligation. You as the giver, you fulfilled your obligation. But then can you also fulfill your obligation while at the same time hitting a lot of the spirit of the law? So let's look at one of the spirits of the law. One of the categories is freeing slaves. Now, and I'm sure, like Dr. Kecia, you were mentioning about, that there was some of the scholarly discussions, but at a practical level, we all agreed this should be done. Zakat should be used for bail. We'll figure out the details. We'll make a way. We have to make a way. But we at the spirit, is it based on that they're financially in need? Is it akin to freeing of slaves? Even if somebody makes the argument that they're not technically slaves and it's not freeing a slave, in spirit, it is. In spirit, it is. You're giving somebody their freedom. And so if you can maximize your zakat by fulfilling your obligation, staying within the parameters of the Sharia, and fulfilling that spirit where you're actually, a person can walk out a free person from the prison, that makes it that much more impactful. And then also to know that if one of the categories of zakat was to work to free slaves, then zakat as a tool of abolishing slavery and oppression, it's right there. It's written into the law. So how can we now say, all right, let's use this to go that way, to alleviate poverty, so that people don't have food insecurity and housing insecurity, and we can get out, from there. And anybody listening, if you have like one of those ideas, like Dr. Kecia said, that light bulb moment to turn it into an organization that's impacting people, we need more Muslims taking those light bulb moments and just figuring out a way. Well, what about housing? What if somebody out there buys an apartment building, and now instead of zakat given to people to help in their rent, how about we have a Muslim-owned apartment building, and the rent is subsidized with zakat in a diminishing way, that we're working towards people to be independent of zakat, or home ownership. And there's a lot of, I could just keep going on with ideas. If a person buys a home, some places in the Midwest, the house is only $20,000, $30,000, $40,000. Investors out there, make some diminishing musharaka LLCs where you can buy a home, and through zakat help the person not only pay off their mortgage to you, but then they become a homeowner. And so now we can really maximize and bring home ownership into that. So maybe that's the next phase of Believers Bailout, that it's bail them out of prison, help them pay their rent and get job training, and then turn them into homeowners. And that can only happen with people supporting your work and allowing that, that foundational element of getting people, just let's get them out of prison. And then now the next thing is like, okay, now let's see how we can maximize the use of zakat in other areas. And I'll end on this, which is the nonprofit industry and the nonprofit world in America, and I'm sure Canada is the same, very, very similar. The nonprofit world at this point in our development as a community runs on zakat. That's a fact. We run on zakat. We're not at the point financially as a community, as a Muslim community in the US, where people are fulfilling their zakat, and on top of their zakat, they're given philanthropic contributions in the form of sadaqah, charity that can be used wherever it is, in the form of gifts, in the form of endowments, in the form of bequesting through their estate. We're starting to see that emerge, but it's just emerging right now. By and large, the Muslims, when they give, they want all of their donations to be zakat. There's a big limitation on zakat, and we have to work through that parameters. So a couple of things for you as a donor, if you're listening, when you're figuring out your zakat, give what you have to, and if there's something extra, give it as a non-zakat fund. That will allow organizations like Believers Bailout to use that for non-bail things, because there's staff, there's overhead, there's other things that can't be directly necessarily used by zakat. So think about that. Think about sadaqah, think about gifts, think about endowments, think about if you're talking to your estate planning attorney and making Believers Bailout a beneficiary, so that we have a development of the philanthropy within our community to where it's not just zakat. So zakat is definitely a base, but we need to grow beyond that. And then, so just to remember that Muslim nonprofits in the U.S. right now are running on zakat, and so help those nonprofits grow, understand their process, and if you feel comfortable giving, then give. And I know people diversify their interests and diversify their sadaqah, but one of the other spirits of zakat is that zakat collected from locally should be distributed as locally as possible. Now, when we get into the fiqh discussions of how local does that mean, there's differing opinions, but the idea is that zakat generated from a land should benefit the people of that land. And I know some organizations that have taken as just a guiding factor that they say domestically. They say we just collect, if we're collecting US zakat, it's distributed within the US. And so Believers Bailout is a way to help keep your zakat localized. In addition to sending overseas, we're watching the genocide in Gaza, and may Allah alleviate the pain and their suffering and stop the genocide. And so I know a lot of people are thinking about that overseas. And then there's other, the Rohingya people and helping that, and the India and the floods and Libya and Sudan and the Congo. There's plenty of overseas areas to focus on, but we do have to have with the idea and the spirit of something local, which in domestic believers bailout fits into that, working here, the people here in this land. And so to keep that in mind as you're figuring out who are going to be the beneficiary organizations of distributing your zakat.
Thank you so much, Shaykh Rami. You give us so much to think about by way of, impact of believers bailout and your experience from Taiba. And subhanAllah, because you guys talked about things that I wanted to talk about later more. So I'm happy that we are starting to talk about these things. But I'll transition now to Dr. Ndiaye. The floor is yours, and then we'll open it up for our collective discussion.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Very nice to meet you all. Allah, and thank you, Dr. Kecia, for that wonderful historical introduction, and Dr. Nsour, Rami Nsour, on this emphasis on this spirit of the law. And I will, as an economist and just Muslim citizen of the world, try to stick to that. And one of the things I wanted to start with is really to do a kind of high-level diagnostic, big picture, but it is there mostly to maybe inspire us individually what we can do. So I'll be mostly talking about what's happening globally. I think one first thing I wanted to say is, if you look at inequality between people, this is something that we have found, economists concerned. You have probably heard of many different studies. You probably have on your bookshelf Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century. So it's really front and center in ways people's thinking of this kind of byproduct of capitalism that can also slow down everyone's lives. And in Muslim countries as well, it is no different. The levels of inequality in Muslim countries are to the same order of magnitude as the non-Muslim counterpart countries. So I think also this kind of questions, even within each country, whether the zakat is playing the role that it could play in our societies. At least whether it asks the question whether it is being given efficiently, or whether if it's given, whether it's arriving to those who are the most in need of the zakat. And that's where I wanted to start to do that diagnosis. And so on that front, then we really wonder then, how can we really improve? What insights can we use to maybe inspire people to contribute zakat? Most of the motivations, the wisdom behind zakat collection goes beyond just these economic considerations. That's God's wisdom, but we can maybe on some practical manners also discuss some of those. And I think one of the things that really pushes people to contribute when you look at these contributions is social norms. So the equivalent of zakat in the default world was what you would call a wealth tax. There have been many countries that have attempted a wealth tax over the years. In many European countries, 13 countries at least did it recently, and they abandoned it. And the reason why they abandoned it was that it's a coercive way, that the voluntary nature is much more appealing. And that's that voluntary nature that we have embedded in the principle of zakat, that it is your bond with God. And in that, and your creator, in that then, how that bond can be strengthened, one way is for those who are here watching is, how can you help then develop this social norm as something that that can inspire your friends? Social norms often happen to talking about it, to creating a culture of zakat giving. And in our mosque, in the lectures that people give, often there is discussion of the zakat al-fitr. And zakat al-mal, which is maybe the largest zakat, could be more part of this discussion as well, to really push it to get its full potential. One point also I wanted to mention, especially when we talk about great organizations like Believer Bailout is people really are very motivated on practical terms to contribute when they see some transparency and accountability. And that's where nonprofits like Believer Bailout bring on the table, in that the Zakat, there are many forms that are collected sometimes from an entity or an individual that collects it, and or organizations that are well established that have done it for many years that can push and motivate people to contribute further. So, and I think really developing that is great. And one point that Dr. Kecia mentioned as well is the shift now when we go from the bail economy going to immigration camps. I think really asking ourselves also, how can we be impactful in that migrants are considered also as a category of like the poor who are travelers, people who are in need. How can we make our Zakat impactful in that direction? So I think overall that's just to start a conversation. Some insights maybe that could come from economics or behavioral, the way people behave, in terms of how they can inspire people to contribute to Zakat. And I'm happy to develop the discussion further. There are so many questions to talk about already.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ndiaye. It's wonderful. Okay, so I have actually a few questions that I've been thinking about, and we collectively at Believers Bailout we're thinking about. One of the first things that I want to ask, which is kind of started, Shaykh Rami spoke about this a little bit, about, you know, local versus global community, right? And my question to you all would be, like, how does the Muslim community's sort of conception of who falls within one's local community, right? How does that affect? I mean, it does break down like arbitrary conceptions of community, which are like nation state community kind of like approaches, but it also sometimes blinds us again to the local needs, right, of the poor and the needy. And I'm wondering, just want to listen to more from you guys of how this conception of who is our neighbor, you know, who is our local community, and how does that really impact who do we think about when we think Zakat?
So I can just say something very brief about how we were talking about this early on. But, you know, things have changed over 6 years and many things have happened. I think one of the things that is very interesting about the way money bail operates in the United States, whether it's through bail, cash bail, or bonds, is that it ends up being really a sort of state-by-state system. And so states have local bond funds and local bail funds. And one of the things that ends up being really important for an organization like Believers Bailout is working through an established bond fund, because these are folks who have connections, who do the bailouts, right? And even if there are wraparound services that Believers Bailout volunteers are connecting folks with, having an established process is incredibly helpful, but it means finding an organization that we work with. And so there are a number of state level bail funds and bond funds that we work through, and there's a national network of bail funds and bond funds. I think, you know, the question about what counts as local is, we see a sort of mix, right? We're an incredibly globalized world. We're a global ummah. We're also American citizens, and giving zakat to organizations that spend money internationally after 9/11 is complicated, right? For mostly specious, but nonetheless very real reasons. And so if you're a Muslim in the US and you want to give to Believers Bailout, probably most of the people who are going to be bailed out with that money are going to come from the local community where there's an organization, right? It's mostly going to be Chicago. And so that's fine. Does it mean Muslims couldn't maybe also give to other local bail funds? Well, they're not really set up to say, are we bailing out Muslims with this money, right? Bail funds are a great place to give sadaqah. But if you're concerned about your zakat being used to bail out Muslims, you go through an organization that has this process, which means it's going to be locally in some places. I think that the larger question of who's your neighbor, though, is a really important and complicated one. And part of what I think we're hoping to accomplish still with the work that Believers Bailout is doing is getting more Muslims in the US who do not have in their families, in their communities, personal connections with the criminal justice system in the US to understand Muslims who do have those connections, who end up with those connections, with that heavy weight in their family, in their community, as also Muslim neighbors, right? And if this takes place initially through giving to Believers Bailout, great, but this should also be happening, Boston, right? How many mosques do we have in Boston? The demographics of these mosques look very different. How often, do members of my suburban mosque, where, everybody who isn't a cardiologist is an engineer, how often do we have connections with Muslims from other local areas? Where do we have those connections? When and why? And I think that's not just a question that should occur around zakat and
I think we lost Dr. Kecia. Hope she's able to restore.
Okay. Well, while we're waiting, I wanted just to share a couple of thoughts on that. Excellent question about how do we define local. And I always start, with like seeing what have the fuqaha, what have the legal jurists of our tradition, what have they defined it, and that's where you start seeing some parameters mentioned. Oh, well, here's it back. Oh.
No, I'm done. I said plenty. Please keep going.
I just started. I said I'll fill in I'll be the commercial break until you.
No, I'm done.
This message brought to you by. And so I just said, one of the places that I like to start is like looking at the fiqh parameters. And one of the things that the jurists have mentioned is some of them have said it localized means the distance of travel, which is about 50 US miles. Other scholars have said bil urf, by customary means, like, so it could differ. Now, prior to mass transportation, up in, before 150 years ago, I think that it was something like the majority of the human population was born and buried within 30 miles of where they were buried within 30 miles of where they were born. Now you have the steam engine and the trains and now airplanes and now globalization. Now, I mean, it's brought the community that much closer. So as an example, somebody came home from prison in Illinois, and when he took his shahada in prison, he came home, he was living with his girlfriend. When he contacted us, he said, I want to do a nikah. So we said, okay, can you go down to the local masjid? I don't know where that is. I don't have any connections. He's connected to us in Taiba in California more so, and he has more connections, and he's proximity-wise, not physically, but proximity-wise, he's closer to us than his masjid that's in the next city over, because he's never been there. He doesn't know anybody. So we conducted the nikah for him. So if somebody were to say, who's part of my community or my local community, I would say that brother and his family out there in Illinois, in a very, very rural area, because of that connection. And Dr. Kecia, you had mentioned something about those connections, and that's also something we should think about, that when you're looking to maximize your zakat impact, you want it to get to that most deserving person. Well, how do you do that? You do that with the person who has those connections. So if I wanted to give zakat to somebody that needs it for bail, I work within, people who are in prison, I don't know where to start. So I'm going to call up Believers Bailout or make the donation online and say, hey, here you go. Your world and your community and the proximity. So I'm going to entrust it to you, and then you make that decision. If somebody's working in Gaza, like I'm not going to say, oh, I'll find somebody and send it over there. No, let me find an organization that's established, that's registered, especially with the international things, Dr. Kecia, as you mentioned. Now we're post 9/11, we're concerned about that. And even before that, we were concerned as well, but it just ramped up. I want to work with somebody on the ground who knows the people, and so on. So it's really that local thing is bil urf, is like by custom. And so what is local? I would say it's those networks and those communications.
Thank you so much. Dr. Ndiaye, if you want to...
There was just a comment that just popped up I was reading what local means is, okay, great. So fantastic. I mean, always great to speak after Dr. Nsour. I was going to say also that maybe I would lead the formal definition to the fuqaha, not some being an expert. And if I do a mistake, may God forgive me. I'm someone who wrote an article on a global perspective of zakat, but was just really motivated by the diagnostic of seeing like countries that are the richest in the world, the Muslim countries, and some countries being the poorest in the world, and the fact that there are tools that they can be used that could maybe, whether it goes within zakat or any other forms, Islam has a lot of instruments, tools for social mobility and for redistribution that matter. And I think also maybe there are fuqaha who have given the green light to the UN High Commissioner for the Refugees to collect the zakat, and they have been doing that for a while. And organizations like this give legitimacy because they are well-known organizations. And I think one of the things I would really like to see more of is kind of organization for which there are Muslims at the helm, and maybe the way to resolve the spirit of the law of this global versus local is really have organizations that are so efficient that they can work in many different places. Believer bailout in 150 countries. Dr. Kecia has built a fantastic model that other people can replicate. This can scale things up so that we use the best practices from Believers Bailout and having in all different countries. I think that would be a great way to learn from certain area into the other. And that really shines how the best practices can be done in many places. But yeah, like there are needs everywhere. It's great to help your neighbors, your family, your neighbors, your area first before scaling beyond where you are.
Yeah, and I want to mention that global element is there in the zakat. We have to be thinking about the global and the local, like it's both. So it's not just one and the other. And you've piqued my interest with that article that you wrote about the global zakat. I would love to read that. It also made me think about something that you mentioned earlier about a motivating factor is the transparency. And so, when an organization decides how we're going to distribute zakat, they're looking at that. They're looking at modern fatwas, old fatwas. What do the books say? Maybe there's a different interpretation. They're making all of these. They're looking at that, and this is why I just was mentioning this to somebody a couple of days ago. I said, if somebody, as long as an organization writes out their zakat policy and says this is what we feel comfortable with, and it's transparent, it's there on our website, and then the giver, when they read that, that's the due diligence on the giver is to know what is the process. Some people just look, I trust them, whatever they choose and whatever they've gone through, I trust them. Other people are like, no, I want to see your policy. And I've had people read the Theba policy and like, I'm not comfortable with it. I'm saying, well, you're not offending me by saying you don't feel comfortable with the policy. I'm actually more power to you. You're doing your due diligence. As long as we make that policy available for the giver and say this is some of the differences of opinion, this is how we've chosen to apply. Now you, the giver, you're free to make a donation, and once you do that, this is how we're going to use it. So I'm a big proponent of that transparency, and I know because I've had conversations with some of the folks at Believers Bailout, there is that due diligence happening behind the scene, and to say like, okay, what are the parameters that we can work on? And then we have to, at the end of the day, make a logistical decision of what we choose.
Thank you all so much. I really appreciate each of your comments. I mean, I think even when we're thinking about local and global, we're not even thinking about like local related to incarceration and global related to whatever hunger or whatever it is. I think also the prison industrial complex, that's something that we talk about, is also has international manifestations. Many Muslim countries they have vicious prison industrial complex as well. And that gives us an idea to think about when we think global, also thinking about prisoners and people who are incarcerated abroad as well. A comment in YouTube from Daniela, she says, what local means in a deeply stratified society like the US is tricky, which is why thinking about making the local, building the local through zakat is crucial. Reparative of the social fabric, so something more regenerative, like we have to make community or make local through that process of zakat, which I think is a really important point. I wanted to, this last question probably, if we have time, we just kind of touches on this, and I think all of you touched on this kind of like parameters of zakah, the limitations as opposed to sadaqah, which is more broad in terms of categories of who are eligible for zakah. My question is like, how much does our analysis and diagnosis of structural forms of injustice in the United States limit our thinking of zakat? So when we can think, okay, zakat has 8 categories. There are the faqir, miskin, all the categories, right? But sometimes there are limitations on how we come. Who do we think about as the faqir and the miskin and al-gharimin, right? And those who are in debt. Who do we think about when we think zakat? And so, like, even yes, zakat there's restrictions that are through the law, but there's also sometimes our restrictions and limitations comes from our inability to kind of think critically about structural injustice in our current context, right? And so we just wanted to open the discussion, is that it took us some time to think about a person in jail, as a person who's eligible to zakat, and why that's the case. And that's kind of something that makes you think that there are some limitations in how we come to think about poverty, about incarceration, about all these things that that we don't make the connection very fast. It took us some time to do that. The floor is yours.
So yeah, I can start talking about this, I think, and because it's related to many societies' conceptions of just like how they define their social programs. And in the US, there is this notion of the deserving poor and the undeserving poor, which is, in fact, some people have found that some of the main differences of why social programs are so low in the US is because of people, yeah, they think there are deserving poor and undeserving poor, and often it comes with racism as well. That the more the darker person is the undeserving poor, and the other one is the poor person who just got like left out. And so I think that is often something that kind of frames the way we think of things, whether it's consciously or subconsciously. And I could see that how it manifests through the prison system. People, like, there is something lingering in the mind. Oh, someone who has done something wrong. While repentance and tawbah is always something that is emphasized in our belief system, in our religion. So I think that's something we need to think of. All of those things we ingrained that could be in the deserving poor and undeserving poor. A lot of the policies that try to get that, try to incentivize it, to say, okay, let's do so. For example, if I look at economic policies, one thing that US does, instead of just saying, okay, you don't earn enough, let me give you some earning power, we say, okay, let's do you what is called the earned income tax credit, which is, oh, if you're working, I'm going to give you a little bit more because you are a deserving poor. You are not an undeserving poor. So then we can start thinking of like more people who are disabled, people who have who have had substance abuse in their life. All of these people are poor, and see how we can help them out, who sometimes are considered as undeserving poor. And of course, people who are discriminated against as well.
Thank you for that.
So let me chime in, because I think what Dr. Ndiaye is talking about brings up not just this category of the deserving and the undeserving poor, but this idea that it's not just zakat, right, that we have available as a tool to confront social inequalities with and social injustices with, right? I mean, zakat is a wealth tax, which I think is a good and important thing. But as Americans, we also pay income tax. We're paying 25%, 30%, 40% of our paychecks in various kinds of income taxes. Are those dollars being used the way they should be? Are those dollars being distributed fairly? For most people, what they pay in income tax is going to be more than what they owe in zakat in any given year. That's not going to be true for everyone, but it's true for a lot of people. And so thinking about how we are addressing hunger, how we are addressing housing, how we are addressing policy issues like the existence of money bail, right? That has to come outside of our zakat. That has to come through electoral politics. It has to come through serving on local community boards and community councils. It has to come with all kinds of other social movement activity to address the really big issues of resource allocation in our society.
I want to build on like what both of you had shared in terms of looking beyond just the direct things in front of us. And this is what we're supposed to be as believers. We're supposed to look beyond and take lessons. And one of the words for lessons in Quran is ibra, a lesson, which it comes from abara, which means to cross over. So we see like right here, there's something here, but Allah is indicating like just keep going with that, run with that. So we're always proud about the Muslim accomplishments in the sciences and mathematics and medicine. What caused them to do that? One of the things is they developed algebra to figure out inheritance laws. They developed other sciences, and spherical trigonometry, and Biruni was one of the first to figure out the Qibla. So Allah said, face your, towards the Qibla and look at the stars. And the Muslims like, oh yeah, there's something else here. Let's figure this out. And then they just ran. So now let's not just stop with zakat and fulfill the basic obligation. Let's see, what is Allah pointing us towards? He's pointing us, there's a thing called economic oppression. There's a thing called, uplifting people. There's people that you just need a small amount of money, like there's some nonprofits where just small investment, huge impact. And so let's start looking at that and looking more at the deeper things that zakat is trying to heal. So as an example, and I think one of the questions was about the strata of society. So when we're thinking about believers bailout, well, that's a carceral system, the U.S. prison incarceration system. Anybody who's read about it and learned about it, it grows directly after the Civil War, out of slavery. So it's directly connected to slavery. The U.S. economy in 1859 was 60% of the U.S. economy in 1859 was based on cotton. So this country was built on slavery, and then the inheritor of the slavery is the prison system. And so now we're faced with, okay, let's try to dismantle as much as we can. So let's get somebody out of prison. If they were in there for 6 months in jail, let's pay their bail. If they were in there 25 years as a lifer, let's get a lawyer, at there and start breaking away at the fabric of these systems of oppression through using our zakat and other forms as well. And we need some divergent and creative thinking. We need to see, how can we do this? I'm just going to throw out two examples. One thing that I've thought a lot about that Muslims really need to be utilizing their zakat is to helping the indigenous people here in the U.S. First Nations in Canada and the indigenous people here in the U.S., where there's some places that don't even have drinking water or heat. What would happen if we took huge chunks of zakat to those and with no intention of proselytization, because we know of the trauma that they already have of handing out with one hand and expecting a book in the other hand, just like the Quran says, La nuridu minkum jaza'an wa la shukura. We give you and feed you for the sake of Allah. We don't want any thanks or anything. We're not looking to convert you. If you convert, alhamdulillah. If you don't, alhamdulillah. We're not here to convert you. We're here to help you. Can we funnel zakat to help buy back land? Instead of waiting for the government to give land that was promised to them for some of their reservations, well, how about we start buying land and then gifting it to indigenous people and helping them establish the reservations? There's just a lot of ideas, but it does require some divergent thinking, some creativity, and then working as well with economists, with activists, with researchers. It's really a roundtable discussion. It should not be held, the decision-making for how to impact zakat should not be just with the religious scholars or with just the wealthy. It shouldn't be one. Everybody's voice needs. The recipients need to have a voice at the table. The givers need a voice at the table. The economists, the lawyers, the doctors, the butchers, the bakers, the candlestick makers.
Thank you all so much. Y'all answered my last question, which is like, what are other oppressive structures that you want to abolish through zakat? And then we talked about, land for indigenous people. We've talked about debt generally, like student debt and other things. That's like, there's so many potential topics and potential structures that zakat can impact, and also sadaqah, just generally giving, that can really alter these structures. I want to open it up to the audience. There are a few questions and comments. There's a question here by Ahmed Tijani. Question for Dr. Ndiaye. Given that wealth tax, like zakat, avoids much of the distortionary incentive effects of income tax and aids in income redistribution, why isn't this form of zakat more popular? Let me just say it again. Given that wealth tax, like zakat, avoids much of the distortionary incentive effects of income tax and aids in income redistribution, why isn't this form of zakat more popular?
Great. So I think the question needs some translation first. He's saying that an income tax often would maybe tell some people, oh, I'm not going to do this economic activity because if I work, this extra amount is going to be taxed. I'm going to have my top tax at 40%. But the wealth, I've already had this wealth, so it's a pile that we can take on. So that's what he might mean by less distortionary. So the idea of a wealth tax is very popular now, but the implementation is hard. And that's, again, maybe coming back to what Dr. Nsour just said, which is the guidance that we receive through these examples, whether it is getting the Qibla, trigonometry comes out of there, mathematics through inheritance laws, and here now an invitation to discover a sustainable economic system through the example, like the idea of zakat. It's really, then people no, the diagnosis is clear. Inequality is a problem. Inequality is a problem, diagnosis is clear, and we are going to a wall. Now, wealth tax have not worked in practice, and I think, like I said, many countries, they did it, they implemented it, and they took it away. The problem is one of evasion, is that if the person is not motivated through it, they just see it as a capture. And in fact, for example, in the US, in Europe, there have been many, but not in the US in recent times, because often many constitutionalists interpret as it going against the Constitution. The US has this notion of individual property rights, so you're like expropriating people. So it really, the wisdom that comes with the zakat is really there, present and needed, that it's a voluntary one that goes beyond just these like life considerations, that goes beyond it, that you're doing it as a voluntary act. And that's really something that we can contribute to. So it is, we have the opportunity to establish and implement the best tool that economists have considered to be able to resolve inequality, but that faces limitations that comes with us. But there are ways that we can improve it within us, within our communities, and inshallah beyond.
So are you saying that if we were hypothetically to say two structures, one country where they have a mandated tax on the people and another country where there's no mandation but there's zakat, that it's more likely that you would have more funds generated from the zakat that's voluntary than the mandated wealth tax?
So what I'm saying is a bit different. What I'm saying is the wisdom behind why the zakat is an individual. So there is no, in the world, if you don't pay zakat, there is nobody that coming and taking you to jail. And I think, and it has been around, the wealth taxes have been around in many different times of the world, but they have been abandoned as failures. Zakat has been around and it's not going anywhere. It is at least doing its basic function. And we see also that for example, if you compare other charitable giving, forms of charitable giving in the US are pretty large. So people, especially people with like religious convictions, they tend to contribute a lot to their churches and so on. And that's where I think when it comes to forms of income that is more like wealth, that is more like property, these voluntary acts tend to work better than the expropriation part. Because once you do expropriate, people move. People tend to be very much care about just like this level of fairness of someone taking it from me, even if it's not, if it's not, what are they doing with it? You know, what will the government do with it? So I think really it's both something that, you know, that we can build on the voluntary nature, and we can maybe try to strengthen it by saying, okay, it's still voluntary, but I can create structure that can collect it and do something with it. And if, for example, let's say to come into your terms, your words that you use, a government say, okay, now, yeah, this is still voluntary, but I'm opening an office to collect it for you, and I'm going to use it. And this can be, for example, for many countries, especially in poorer countries, and this comes back to what Allah said, mentioned about making links. Debt is one of the main forms of financing in many poorer countries, including Senegal, where I'm from. And we call this cooperation with other countries. And I think an organization like the IOC, International Organization Cooperation, could play the role of creating a cooperation based on both the local links that happen through Zakat and beyond, a cooperation of helping sadaqah between each other rather than a cooperation of debt. So we can build on this voluntary nature by building structures that can piggyback on it. Yeah, that's kind of what I meant.
Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you so much. We have a really nice comment from Amina Shakur. She says, Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for this. I am so grateful to hear this discussion and to hear no judgment around the nature of charges around who deserves bail and bond/bond support. Also, the importance of hearing you use words like abolition and acknowledging the racism backed into prison-industrial complex here. And then so refreshing to hear you connect this and name the justification that is freeing slaves, which really makes it incumbent upon all of us to have who have the means to contribute. I don't think I'm seeing any more questions. There is a question, I think a follow-up from Ahmed Tijani. If I'm understanding a bit clearly, the system and mandatory wealth tax have not worked as well as Zakat due to the lack of buy-in, which is more implicit in Zakat. Great. One last thing, I think Mariam had wanted us to talk a little bit about boycott, and I know that Dr. Ndiaye has spoken about, has written about international boycotts, and that's something that is in our minds as, you know, the genocide is unfolding in Gaza, and like the economic ways by which we can have an impact on apartheid and the occupation. And so I wonder what has been in your minds in relation to, you know, generally Islamic moral and moral philosophy, moral theology, law that really have been helping you think about where we can make interventions as Muslims with regards to boycotts.
Okay, so I can start. I think, yeah. So I have a paper where I look at what is a boycott as a tool, and there is a lot of kind of people looking at what they call geo-economic questions. We talked about sanctions for a long period of time over the last 2 years. There have been flurry of studies on these issues. So I'm like, okay, let me study something more like top-down, such as boycotts. And I think one of the main things that I learned is just that boycotts can be actually a very tool in favor and can be popular in a sense of when you start thinking of it more as a switching to alternatives, which is if you want to boycott for a certain reason, for a certain cause, let's say, okay, I'm switching to a domestic alternative. And let's say, okay, I'm boycotting this place, I'm buying American, and you switch to an alternative that is not too costly for you to switch. You're boosting also the American company in that regard, and that can be actually even beneficial overall for that country. So this switching kind of to say, and also especially in times that we are going where there are actually very dangerous policies that are on the table, which have to be discussed, where they're going to go beyond countries foreign countries kind of telling people what to do. They are now where they want us to say now, oh, if a non-profit tells you to boycott an ally of the US, you can have criminal and civil penalties. And I think that's something we really need to discuss and address, and have leaders to mention that, because that would really reduce people's freedom of action and speech. So I really think also kind of emphasizing that people have the right to have an alternative to switch to buying American is a great way to talk about it, and a great way to do it as well. And that would also be impactful, and boycotts can be impactful. In fact, as we see, even in other contexts, sanctions haven't been always impactful to achieve something. Sanctions, these are like these top-down approaches, but boycotts have been very impactful. Boycotts have been around for a very long time, since Athens. China is a country that uses a lot of boycott, and there have been a lot of geopolitical boycotts, from the Iraq War, from U.S. boycotting French goods. So there is no difference if Muslims, with their 25% of the world, and I would imagine also purchasing power of equivalent nature, can use that tool as an effective economic policy to make change and have their voices heard, and switch really to take an alternative to consuming American, consuming Muslim, or consuming those goods that they value. That's pretty much what I wanted to say about boycotts.
Again, you've piqued my interest. I'm now going to follow your articles. Is there a way that we can learn where your articles are and read? I'm going to be following your work and bothering you with like some questions every now and then of where I can learn about your work. And you mentioned you're from Senegal. I studied in Mauritania. There's a lot of crossover between the two countries. So one of the Senegalese scholars that I benefited a lot from was Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba. Not directly, because he passed away almost 100 years ago, but his books are still taught, and it's living in that. And Medina Touba, the city that he established, literally coming under a tree and starting a whole city. And you can speak more to this, but there's a lot of economic independence in that city, and there's also, it's semi-autonomously run. They have such a strong economy. And one of the things that Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba told his followers was that the two most important things in the Quran are prayer and giving zakat. And he said, you're all praying, but you got to give zakat, and to give zakat you have to work. So there's a strong work ethic. He's infusing that into the community. You see that now. The other thing that I heard that he did as well is he said, other people had taken forms of military resistance against the French. Some resisted militarily, some resisted by immigrating. There's a lot of people that just immigrate from Nigeria, went to Sudan, from Mauritania, that went to the Hijaz. And so he says, well, we're not going to leave our countries open for the colonizers to take over, and we can't fight them militarily. So let's resist them economically, culturally, and religiously. Be strong on your Islam. Be proud of your language. You can learn French if you want to, but don't give up Wolof for the French language. Don't eat their sugar. We can do without their sugar. We don't need their rice. We can grow our own millet. We don't need, we don't need their coffee. We can grow our own coffee. And so Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba, boycotted French coffee, French sugar, French rice, French, all of these other products. And showed, like, anybody who's interested in seeing that, like Medina Touba is an example, that we have the blueprint, and we have nonviolence as an example before Gandhi and before Martin Luther King, with no detraction from the work that they did, but we have that from within. One of a very famous scholar and saint and an amazing person. We also know the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He himself had his companions boycott certain people. So it's not something that's foreign to us. One of the things that's happened is the politicization of Islam and of scholars and pushing the agenda of the government. So you'll have scholars get up on mimbars around the world and say, no, don't do boycotts, and we should, government relations, and this is against our deen. So they're going to use the religion to suppress resistance, to suppress boycotting, and to suppress voices as well. And so there's this quietism that's being pushed at multiple, and it's not one group or another. It's just unfortunately sometimes the clergy that runs with the government will serve its needs and become part of the mercenaries, as one person explained, like the mercenary clergy of the oppressors. So we do have to be thinking about boycotts and about having control over our money. One of the things that I would like to see in the U.S. is more Muslims speaking up about control over their taxes. So we're not going to stop paying taxes. That's how the government's going to get you. When they couldn't pin anything on Al Capone, they got him on tax evasion. So you're not going to get around paying taxes. But what if we can lobby the government and start changing at the policy level to start saying, we don't want it for the prison industrial complex. We don't want it for the military industrial complex. And there's other methods as well that we can control more of our money. One is nonprofits and putting more of our wealth into nonprofits or foundations. If people have wealth, they should think about starting family foundation and be able to put your money into that. There's also other ways that you can use businesses as well to support businesses. And have your money go to support those businesses, and then as tax write-offs support those businesses rather than just giving it to the government. So we do have to be thinking more strategically without breaking any laws. No Sharia laws breaking and skirting the Zakat definitions, and as well skirting the last ones. One thing I do want to just throw out there for the viewers, when we think about creatively about impact of zakat, one of the things that really was interesting, one of the definition of who is a poor person and a recipient varies from madhab to madhab. According to the Hanafi school, it's somebody who has 400 dirhams, which is about 200 dirhams, which is the equivalent about $400. So if you have $400, you're not a faqir. Well, you can imagine that's going to most people, even some people who are unhoused, have $200 to their name. The Maliki school says it's 1 year of living. So if you have in your bank enough to cover you for 1 year, you're not a faqir. But less than that, which includes most people. The Shafi'i school says muddat al-ta'mir. It says up to 60 years. Like if you don't have to your name enough money for 60 years to live out, like to retire, no work, and to live out for 60 years, then you're a faqir according to Imam Shafi'i. Now, what would that do if we said, let's use zakat to alleviate poverty, with the definition of poverty being the ability to retire and support yourself until 60 years old? Doesn't that like make the open the field a lot more? So just throwing it out there.
I'm mindful that we are just about at our time. So the only thing I want to say in closing is I'm really heartened by the incredibly expansive conversation that we've had, right? That's gone from the little idea of zakat as money bail to, how do we retire and live for 60 years? Doing good work and reading good books, right? I think there is so much injustice and there is so much suffering, and there are so many things that are going wrong that require people to do their best work to set them right. And being here and having these conversations is a good place to start. So I'm very grateful to the folks who are doing most of the work of Believers Bailout these days for putting together this conversation, and to Dr. Nsour and Dr. Ndiaye, and to you, Ala, and to Mariam behind the scenes, and Nabiha, and everybody who is doing this work.
The thanks is to you. We're really grateful for your time and the conversations, and this is really a starting point for further conversations as well. So I'm really, really glad that we were able to sit and talk. This was one of two virtual conversations that Believers Bailout is organizing, like leading up to Ramadan. So the second conversation is actually going to be on this Sunday at 6:30, where we'll be hosting a conversation between Brother Claiborne Qadzi, a member of our community, and folks from Chicago Torture Justice Center. And the conversation is going to be about Brother Qazi's experience of incarceration and legal activism in the prison system, highlighting really what liberation for and by our community looks like. So tune in for that conversation Sunday at 6:30, inshallah. But Ramadan Mubarak. I know Ramadan is coming next week, so I hope everyone witnesses it with reverence and health and physically, emotionally, spiritually, psychologically, both here and abroad in Gaza and Palestine and all the areas in which there's suffering. Thank you so much. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.
Salam.